Laurie Huston's News for the Heart is dedicated to helping you give a voice to your own soul. Our hearts have the power to free us from pain and the struggles that keep us from awakening to our true essence. Join Laurie now as we delve into our heart and soul to find the path that will open us to the possibilities and lead us to the life we love to live.
Good afternoon. This is News for the Heart. And today I have my amazing and awesome co-host Tom Campbell here today. And well, as you remember last month, I talked about the retreat that we had in the castle in England, which was very amazing. And from that, everybody got together to either have a lunch or a dinner with Tom. And we had a lunch with Tom, and the interesting conversations that came up between Hillary and myself and Marla I just found them really fascinating. We were talking about virtual reality. So we're going to get into that. I know that Tom's a little tired today because he just got home from his trip in Germany. How was that, Tom?
That was a very nice trip. It was long. It took us like 2.5 weeks, but it was very productive.
Oh, good.
Very productive.
Good. And I know you have so many more that are happening, but still thinking that I might be going to the one in Tuscany. that one just sounds awesome.
That's going to be good. Yeah, we're going to take over a whole village in Tuscany for a week. That will be nice. And we'll add an extra day to it. So we won't be pushing through it quite as fast and furious as we did in the castle. It'll be a little more relaxed and not quite so hard.
Hey, yay.
That will be better.
It will be. All right. So we're going to talk about virtual reality. I guess, we've talked about it before, and I know that this is one of probably your favorite conversations. But during the lunch, we sort of talked about the fact that, the larger consciousness. So we are in one of many different virtual realities, but this one specifically gears towards our own growth and where we are as a planet, as a whole, in this particular planet. Would that be correct?
Well, yes, that's correct, but also how we are, our growth as individuals.
Right.
Our growth in the way that we interact with others. And those others have to do with the critters as well as other people, so it's all humanity, but it's also the whole earth, the environment, everything. It's how do we interact? How do we make the choices that are in front of us is the key. So this virtual reality gives us a lot of choices that have a lot of important consequences.
Right.
That's the key. And, our environment has consequences. You can't just, do anything in your environment forever and still expect to live here. You have to be aware of other people. You can't just do anything to other people forever either and expect, to live here. So it's our choices that we make, and those choices either help us evolve or de-evolve the quality of our consciousness. That's what we're here to do. And this virtual reality gives us a great place to learn that, because it has so many choices with very strong consequences.
Right. So we've got this very specifically created virtual reality that we're all sort of co-creating at the same time, but we're definitely here to grow. And the larger consciousness system has set this up specifically for us to help us grow. Right. Okay. So it brought to mind a bunch of questions about, the fact that so there are many virtual realities. We did some of the exercises that we did at the castle. We were able to connect with other virtual realities if that was a choice, or if we really wanted to go there, that was an option for us. So we know that there are many different types of virtual realities, but this one specifically is geared towards us. It's helping us grow. Obviously, there are different, the other virtual realities may have more evolved, more de-evolved, so it depends on where they are, and how we connect with them. But we can connect with the other virtual realities, but mostly through the larger consciousness system. Is that correct?
Well, that's Yes, that's true most of the time. Now, there's two realities that we connect to all the time
Right.
besides this one. One of them is our dreaming,
Right.
night dreams, and the other one would be our daydreams, right? Those two, we often wander off in our head, and when we do, say in a daydream, we kind of forget this reality. We can get so involved in what we are creating, and we would say in our imagination, that we kind of let this reality go. We're no longer processing this physical universe anymore. We're caught up in our story inside of our heads in this daydream. Well, that is another virtual reality. It's another data stream that defines a reality. And when we do night dreams, that's another virtual reality. It's not this reality, it's some other reality. So all virtual realities don't have to be like this one. There's all sorts of virtual realities, and it depends on the rule set. This virtual reality that we call our physical universe has what I call a very tight rule set. The rules define every single energetic interaction. Everything, every detail is defined, and we call that science. That's physics, that's chemistry and biology. What those sciences do is they dig out the rules in the rule set. That's what they're about. So biology digs out the rules that have to do with biology and so forth. So physics does the ones that have to do with matter and time and space and the things that physics deals with. Chemists deal with the interaction of molecules for the most part. And that is science. So it's this rule set. But in a dream reality,
Right.
it's not that tight. The rule set's kind of loose. You can fly, you can teleport, you can do all sorts of things in the dream reality that you can't do here because their rule set is very loose. But both of those alternate realities are there for the same purpose, and that is to give us a chance to make choices. And by those choices, we evolve or de-evolve.
Right. Right. Did you get just stuck yet there?
We wouldn't get here.
Okay, we somehow you got stuck. I'm not quite sure how, but
It says,
we missed a little bit there.
okay, I just got a little thing came on the board that says your internet is unstable. Now, I don't know why that would be, but usually I have very good internet.
Yes, you do.
Maybe it will heal itself.
Maybe it will.
Okay. So anyway, what part did you lose? Should I back up just a little?
I think we got the idea. So there's the different realities that are within our reality, which that's kind of cool. And the rule set of this reality, and it is here to help us grow or de-evolve, which I guess, well, we know that happens. Although we have, the way we talked about it at the castle was that it made it sound like it really has been set up very specifically for the group of people that are around that to help us evolve perfectly the way we're meant to. Like it was really well created and balanced. We have all these other things, all these other tools that we can use, but they only seem to be added in when we find use for them. And so that was what we were sort of talking about, how, the stars, people probably didn't pay a lot of attention to the stars. And it was only once we started to chart the stars that the stars actually had to be there, if I remember correctly from our conversation. So it's like once we need certain things, then the larger consciousness impacts those things into our virtual reality so that they can have meaning and they can be part of our evolution,
Right.
which is really the goal. No matter what, the goal is to evolve towards love, to get out, to lower the entropy, to find that place that we can all, I don't know, do we all grow together? Like, is this a specific, soul group that we all work with? Is it, different individuals to help us? It seems really interesting, but it seems, I don't know. It seems like everything is here for a reason. We always say that, but this really makes it feel very determined. Does that make, I don't know if that's the right word, but.
Well, it's not deterministic in that
Right.
sense. It's probabilistic. But yes, everything has, is here for a reason. And we can say that that's because choices are the things that we grow by, right? By how we make choices. Well, everything causes us choices, right? Bad weather causes us to make different choices. Everything, ends up in a choice. So because this reality gives us so many choices, many of which are moral choices, choices that are important, choices that affect not only ourselves, but other people. Therefore, they have consequences, not only to us, but other people. Gives us more responsibility than if it was just us. So this is a multiplayer game, and we have to share it and interact with a lot of other players who are also playing in that game. So there's almost no set of choices that is not useful. That's why I say everything can serve a purpose. So if you are born with no legs, then you won't have the same experience as somebody who's born with legs, but you will still have choices, and you'll have different choices. So you'll get a different set of choices that will allow you to grow, and those choices and that growth will be very valuable. So there's no situation, no matter how poor you are or how wealthy you are or whatever, you still have choices to make, and by those choices, you can grow. And the kind of choices we're talking about are not so much material choices, but they are choices of how you interact and react to other people. Those are the choices that matter most. Those are the kind of the moral choices, the choices that just aren't about you. They're about others. So those are the choices. So there isn't any situation that I can think of that you don't have an opportunity to interact and react with other people. And it doesn't have to just be people, with other animals. People just being one of the animals that lives here. So it's everything. And with the environment, you interact with that as well. So all these interactions require choice, and that choice requires responsibility. You can make good choices or bad choices. So there isn't any situation you can be in that says, oh, this is a terrible set of choices. Well, you probably say that because it's not the set of choices you'd like to have. But whether you like to have them or not, there are choices there by which you can evolve or de-evolve. And if you see reality in the sense that you just have to deal with what happens and deal with it in the most positive way possible, the low entropy solution, I would say, is how you have to deal with it, as much love as possible, then you're going to evolve, which is the whole point here. Yeah, the point isn't how much money you can collect before you die. That's irrelevant. It's how, what's the quality of those choices? Are they about love, or are they about self-centeredness? Are they about fear? What's your motivation? What drives those choices, love or fear? So that's what we're trying to grow up. So there isn't any situation where you don't have choices and you don't interact with anybody or anything. It just, that would be an extremely rare circumstance, that you would have something like that. So this is a multiplayer game. That means we have to play with a lot of other people, and the things we choose to do affects others, and the things that others choose to do affects us. So we're all in this thing together. Whereas your dream and your daydream is like a single player game. You're the player, and you're getting a data stream from the larger conscious system, and it still gives you choices. And the choices are great because they're choices that you wouldn't get here. In the dream, you're in a dream and some kind of fantastical thing happens, right? You're suddenly in a burning building, and you have the choice. Do I go upstairs and wake up the other people living up there, tell them there's a fire, or do I just get out, and make sure that I get out? So that's your choice. And you wouldn't want to do that here because it would affect a whole lot of other people. It would be a real big disaster. In a dream, you get that choice without any of the consequences. So it puts us in a place where we can have more dramatic choices. And so do our daydreams often put us in a more dramatic space that we wouldn't really want to be doing here. Right. So all those they're all independent realities. They're not ones inside the other. They're all independent realities. And it's they all give us data streams by which we interpret the data for that reality. And they're all doing basically the same thing, giving us choices to make, because that's our job. is to grow up. And the way you grow up is by applying, the quality of your consciousness. You apply it to a problem by making choices. So you apply it, and then it either helps decrease entropy, it increases it. It either moves things toward fear or toward love. And that's really the point of it. And one more thing I should say, and that is that because the system was generated for us to be players in this system, and for all the other critters to be players in this system, but let's say it was generated primarily for us because we are some of the more, so we say, we get more choices than anybody else. We get, others may be just as bright, if not brighter than us, like dolphins or orca or that sort of thing. They have bigger brains than we do. So they may even be smarter than we are, but they don't affect things. They don't have the set of choices that we have. I think your kitty's going to lie down.
She's really enjoying this conversation about the critters, and she's like, "Okay, I'm just showing you that."
I think she's saying,
"Very happy."
Did you rub my belly?
Yep.
I think that's the message you're getting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, she's just making a big point about critters, and
yeah.
Okay, so I really liked how you talked about how our own individual story is our own virtual reality, because that affects a lot of the things that we've always talked about with choices and fears. And I get that. I get that story helps us understand our own individual fears and choices that we make.
Mm-hmm.
I guess when I think about our conversation, it was more about how the bigger picture, or the bigger virtual reality that we're in, and how that affects us. But that, things only come to us if we actually need them in our virtual reality. So when we think about so many people, I think about the news and how some people get very attached to the news, and how they, get very judgmental and justified in their feelings and about politics and religion. So there's that aspect that, some people get really, she clearly doesn't care about that. Just touch my belly, please. But so some of us get really involved in the outside world, and some of us, pertain mostly to the inner world in our own inner story, so we can grow and evolve from there. But the outer story, that story that some people get really connected to. So, there's lots of people that say that there's, aliens on the planet and how they affect us. But I got the feeling, the way we were talking about our virtual reality, is that it doesn't really have, other alien races, unless they're somehow co-creating with us and they're part of this virtual reality. But if they're part of another virtual reality, they're not likely going to interfere in this reality. Like, it's not like or is it?
Well, if they're part of this physical universe,
yes,
then they're part of this reality. Our reality is the entire physical universe. That's the place, that's our map that we live on, okay, is in that. So if they come from some other planet and some other galaxy far, far away, then yes, they would be, in the same virtual reality that we're in.
But we haven't identified them yet, have we? Like, we haven't. So therefore, do they exist yet?
Well, but you see, it's the interaction you're talking about. They don't exist for us. Let's say for you and I.
Right.
We only say for all the humans, because there's some humans, I'm sure, that would say, they go to lunch with an alien every day. But for us anyway, they don't exist for us because we've not personally interacted with one. So until we do, then we should be very skeptical. Now, after we do interact with one and have lunch, and, they take us for a trip, back to where they come from, and we have all this experience, then we can think differently. But one should always stay both open-minded, anything could happen, and skeptical. And if it's not your experience, it can't be your truth. So because somebody else says, oh yeah, I meet aliens and we go to lunch, every other Friday, and I've been to their home and they've been to mine, and they can say all this sort of thing. But if it's not your experience, it's not your truth. It's somebody else's truth. The one who was experiencing it. Okay, it may be their truth, but it's not your truth. So you have to remain skeptical until you have experience where it becomes your truth. So you can read about things.
Right.
And depending on the overwhelming amount of evidence, you can rate that as more or less probable. So we haven't experienced everything. I've never been to China,
Right.
but I'm rather certain that China exists.
Good point.
You see, I've never been to China, but China exists. And that's because I've read about it. And when I was, 5 years old, we looked at all the major land masses in the world and the politics. And, it's been a part of your life for a long time. And people who are Chinese, and you watched movies, that were taking place in China and so on. So you've had that kind of thing. So at that point, you'd say, well, I've never been to China, but I'll give it a 99.9999% chance that it is a real thing, and I'm not just being fooled by people who are making this up. So, but still, that 0.999 isn't necessarily a 1. You see, it's not necessarily a 1. You may be 5 or 6 nines after that, 0.9999. But with certainty, you shouldn't be certain unless you have your own experience. Then you understand it much better. Because though it may be almost a certainty that there is a China, exactly what that China is like, and what its people are like, and what its culture is like, and the things that they do differently, and the things that they do that are the same, the way they see life, and so on, their heritage, their culture, that's different. And I don't know much at all about that. And even though I've read a little bit about it, I still would say that, no, I just have to be skeptical. I don't know. I just don't know that much about Chinese culture. And I don't think you would unless you've been there, unless you experienced it. Even if you read books about it, I don't think you'd really appreciate it until you'd been there. So it depends on the thing. Something obvious like China's existence, yeah, okay, I'll say it exists. And I'll make that statement because the 0.99999, it goes so far out that it's very close to a 1, even though I've never actually seen it for myself. I've seen it on maps, and I know that the maps aren't likely to be drawn up to trick me, because that would be silly. You'd have to be paranoid to think that all the maps you've seen since you were 5-year-old were made just to trick people. That would be rather silly, and it would mean that there were billions of people in cooperation to trick you, which is kind of ridiculous. So that's different. But when we talk about aliens, you see, it's not like that. Aliens are something that a very, very small percentage of the people say they have some personal information about it. Maybe 1/1000th of 1%, of the population. It's not at all like China. So my skepticism on that is going to run a lot higher. It's not going to be 0.9999. It's going to be maybe 0.3 or 0.2 or 0.1. So I remain very skeptical about all of that. And my skepticism is probably even greater than many other scientists. Scientists in general say, well, there's so many suns, trillions of suns, with so many potential planets out there, that certainly there's something that approximates what we have here, that life as we know it here, carbon-based life, based on water and that sort of thing. Surely that must exist in these trillions and trillions of other situations. It would be just almost unbelievable that we, out of all these trillions of trillions of trillions of possibilities, we're the only one that could produce life. So scientists tend to believe that. Just looking at the statistics, it says surely there must be something someplace else. On the other hand, we can make a very good argument that there is nobody else but us, because this isn't a physical reality, it's a virtual reality. A virtual reality has players, and you only need so many seats. You see, If this were a physical reality, then you'd expect that there'd be aliens out there someplace in this huge universe. But this isn't a physical reality. It's a virtual reality. And in a virtual reality, it's made for players. And you only need so many players in the game, right? Otherwise, the computer would have trouble keeping up. If you had, if World of Warcraft had 1 billion players, the computers would all crash. It takes up more resources, more time. And the system has to look at this as a cost-benefit analysis. What benefit do I get out of adding another player to one that already has 7.5 billion players? If I add a player, how much more am I going to get out of that? How much more lowered entropy am I going to get? And that would be the benefit. And how much cost is that? I'm going to have to feed that entity a data stream. I'm going to have to, be producing that avatar and doing those choices and interactions and all that sort of thing. So that's the system has to make this cost-benefit analysis. And eventually, it would seem to me, you'd get to a point that adding another player costs more than it's worth. In that point, you'd get to the place where we don't need any more players. Well, how many players does it need? I suspect we may get to 10 billion, or who knows what the carrying capacity is of our planet, but we'll get to bigger numbers. And does the system need more than that? Well, if the system says, yeah, I need 1,000,000 times more than that, well, then there's probably other seats, in this same virtual reality on some other planet in some other galaxy far, far away. But if it's like, no, actually the 7.5 billion I have is, plenty. I don't need any more seats. Then this virtual reality would have just us. We would be the only ones playing here. And all the rest of the universe, you think, oh, what a waste. All those trillions and trillions of suns and planets and all that stuff, and there's nobody there. There aren't all those trillions and trillions of things. All those are lights in the sky. They're data we get. If this is a virtual reality, our reality is really created by information. We get sent a data stream. Those things don't actually have to be computed, except when somebody takes their telescope and they look out there, they'll see something. And that person gets that data stream that says what they see. Oh, I see dust, and I see this, and I see that, and I see billions of stars. All right, then that person looks away to talk to their friend. Well, they're not getting that data stream anymore. So the conscious system doesn't have to compute it anymore. And then the person looks back in the telescope. Oh, the system will put that data in their data stream again. So all of those trillions of suns and all those possible planets may just be little specks of light in the sky to us when we look at them, and that's it. And we may be the only act going on here because the system just doesn't need any more seats than that. So when you think of it as a virtual reality rather than a physical reality, that idea there must be some, aliens out there kind of disappears. That's only if it's fundamentally a physical world. Then that would make sense. But if it isn't fundamentally a physical world, if it's a virtual reality, then that doesn't make sense. They're just dots of light in the sky. The system doesn't have to compute all those planets or anything. It can just basically, give us little dots of light. Now, once it gives us dots of light, anybody who looks in the same place will have to see the same dots of light because it has to be continuous, but only when somebody looks. So the system for us, for the almost all of us of the 7.5 billion, only for half a day does anybody get a chance to see stars, and we're asleep for most of that. Because when it's daylight, there's no stars coming in our data streams to define, what's out there. So it's a very trivial thing for the system just to show us what somebody looks at, and the rest of it never has to be computed. And at night when we look up and see, a planet, well, to us, the only thing that's put in our data stream is a dot of light. That's easy. It's just a couple of bits. It gives us a light, its location, its intensity, and its color. That's it. 3 bits, and that's all it has to be. And then when it's daytime, we don't see that. Well, that's not in our data stream anymore. So it's trivial for the system to just have us and not waste any time or energy whatsoever on all the rest of it that's really not being used. So that's just the two perspectives. It's a virtual reality perspective, but it solves an important paradox. There's a paradox called the Fermi paradox. And the Fermi paradox was made by Enrico Fermi, a very well-known physicist, was one of the ones that helped us go into the nuclear age. So whether that makes him a genius or an evil genius, that's a matter of opinion. But in any case, he was a very bright guy. And he and his friends sat around and said, well, given that there is life elsewhere, given that we are in a kind of as time goes, we are about 1 billion years or so behind the early part of the universe that formed before us. And we're probably 1 billion years ahead of the universe that formed after us. So we're kind of in the middle of time as far as this universe being created. So there should have been some beings like us that got started like we did, you see, 1 billion years earlier than we got started.
Right.
Because they would have been in the early part of the universe that formed first. So if that's the case, there should be people out there who have had 1 billion more years to evolve than we have had. Well, where do you think we're going to be in 1 billion years from now? I mean, just look how much life has changed in the last 100 years. And 100 years is almost nothing compared to 1 billion years. So there may be those that are 1 billion years. And they also said, well, even at just pokey old sublight speed, nothing fancy like Star Trek at, warp 4, just old, less than light speed. So we don't break Einstein's rule about you can't go faster than the speed of light. Then just the normal migration of people from planet to planet to planet, they should have been through our part of the universe a long time ago. So the Fermi paradox says, where are they? Not only should they have been through here a long time ago, but they should have inhabited every speck of space that's inhabitable. And for an advanced technology, that would be almost everything, So they should be everywhere. And it would be impossible for us not to notice, because they have to use the same kinds of things in the universe that we do. They still have to deal with things like electromagnetics. That's part of this universe. They'd have to deal with other things that we deal with. And given that they may have technologies that are just, we can't even imagine, still, it would be rather difficult for them to be all over our universe on every imaginable, spot that they could be on, and we don't notice. It's just, it doesn't make sense. That's just the way it is. So, if our universe had been populated early on, then they should have spread to this part, millions and millions of years ago. And they should be all over the moon and all over, the other inhabitable planets and all over, and they should be here, in large numbers, that sort of thing. So we don't really have that evidence that they're here. Right. That en masse, people see a thing, and even if they were trying to be real sneaky and tiptoe around us so we didn't notice, the science would say that would be too hard. They're bound to have a signature of some sort that we would notice. Like they'd all have to live on the dark side of the moon because, we'd see them otherwise, but we have probes that go around the moon and photograph the dark side, and no, there's not alien cities over there either. So that's that's kind of this idea. So we may be alone. We may be the only thing going in this whole universe, and that makes sense from a virtual reality perspective. It makes no sense at all from a physical reality perspective. So those are the different views. But now we see that science is telling us that this is a virtual reality. So, the answer, that's kind of been a big question for, I don't know, maybe 2,000 years, this thing between, is this a virtual reality? Even the Greeks, argued about this, and so did, Buddha, before them and so on. But that big question has been there with very little proof about whether it is or whether it isn't, until we got to the early 1900s when we had the double slit experiment and realized that this cannot be a physical reality. And since then, there's been hundreds and hundreds of other experiments that have said the same thing.
Okay.
So that's, when it comes to the facts, we finally got them. And the answer is, this is not a physical reality. So that means it's a computed reality or an information-based reality, which means aliens, maybe not, but it could be that we've got enough seats here.
Right.
Don't need any more seats.
And okay, so now we're looking at a world that is a very tiny planet that has a lot of resources, but we're kind of making a mess of that. And we have a lot of people on a very tiny planet. And so then the question becomes, well, there's so many things that we can go through with this, but so is the planet really in danger? It's not a physical planet. So, I mean, other than the fact that we're looking at the choices that we're making and the intention upon the choices that we're making and whether we're evolving or de-evolving, but the planet isn't really in danger unless we make terrible choices like nuclear bombs and things. But would there be a benefit for ending this virtual reality, or would there be a benefit for us having to find another planet? Or, it seems like we wouldn't need all of the fears that we have created, for lack of a better word, of all the things that could go wrong, because we definitely like to focus on all the things that could go wrong. But are we really, is anything really in danger if it's just a virtual reality?
Well, you say if it's just a virtual reality, there's nothing more real than a virtual reality. All realities are virtual realities. Virtual realities aren't like fake cousins to real realities.
I get that.
Every reality is a virtual reality. So this reality is a virtual reality. The dream reality is a virtual reality. Daydreaming is a virtual reality. They're all virtual realities. When you go, out of body, it's just it's a single player game, and it's a virtual reality. It's just that what you find there is just for you to make choices. It's your own, kind of personal reality, if you will, to make choices in, even though you meet other entities there. Most of the other entities you meet are NPCs, non-player characters. It's all set up there for you to learn something. So that tends to be the way things are. So yes, we could destroy the Earth. We've probably come up with, half a dozen ways to destroy the Earth, right? We could destroy it with nuclear weapons, and so poison the atmosphere so everything dies. We could do it with global warming. It could get to where the surface of the planet is 200 degrees or something, and nothing lives. We could do it with poor ecology, to where we destroy the Earth's ability to allow us to live here. We destroy all the things that provide sustenance for us. We could pollute everything to the point that it was useless. So there's lots of ways we could destroy the Earth, but it's unlikely that will end this virtual reality. Well, I shouldn't say that. It would end this. It might end this virtual reality, but there's always another virtual reality. This is digital space. You can do all kinds of wonderful things. You can just stop the virtual reality at a place, let's say, 50 years before the Great Catastrophe. And then you can just change a few things and then start it up running again. In other words, you just make a branch off. Or if there was a big meteor coming this way that was going to land and stir up so much dust that it would blank out the sun for 5 years, and then everything dies, right? With no sunlight, all the plant life goes and all the animal life goes, and this becomes an ice rock, then, the system could always just that's a virtual meteor. You see, it's part of the probability sets that meteor's there. There's a lot of statistics. Well, it could just go out and make that disappear, or make it go someplace else, because we haven't actually seen it yet. So it's not on our radar. It could just make that disappear if it wanted to. Or if it needed to, it could basically erase, say, 90% of the population, because this experiment just isn't working out very well. It's going downhill, and just start over. We could take those 10% of the people and try to build it back up again and see if we couldn't do better, or see if we make the same mistakes. So there's lots of options in a digital system, lots of things. And it could just take the beings here and start another virtual reality, very similar to this one, same rule set. It could just start it up and repopulate it with the same beings. And for a while, everything would seem very strange, but 1,000 years later, nobody would know that anything ever happened. It was that sort of thing. So there's lots of options, but we as individuated units of consciousness will always have a playground to play in, to make choices, because the system needs that. We are part of its strategy to evolve. As we evolve, it evolves. We're a piece of that consciousness system. So as we evolve, our evolution is also its evolution. So it's has a motivation to keep us learning as quickly and efficiently as possible. So I think we'll always have a schoolhouse. It may not just be this one, and it may be that there's only a few of us left to rebuild, who knows, but it's not like that's gonna end, because there's a need, and the system really is in charge and could solve that problem lots of different ways.
And it's unfortunately because it's our choices that will determine what happens, even though
Exactly.
it's the few versus the total. So yeah, okay, I get it.
That's the way it works. But we create this reality in many ways. Okay, there's three ways we create it. And one way is our intention modifies future probability. So if we're miserable and unhappy, we tend to create miserable, unhappy things. If we're very positive and loving and caring, we tend to create more loving and caring things. That's been around a long, long time. Back in the 50s, it was the power of positive thinking. And
Right.
then in the early 2000s, it was The Secret. It was a big deal about program the universe to meet your needs. And, this idea that we can modify what happens has been around almost forever. And it's true, it works. But the way it works is just that we can modify future probability. That's one way. And another way is that we get a data stream and we interpret it. We can interpret it however we want. We interpret it based on our own fears, our own beliefs, our own knowledge. We interpret that, and that interpretation of that data is our reality. That's the reality we see. So every one of us lives in a unique reality of our own, but it's also a shared reality. And that's the last way we can create our own reality, is by our actions and the way we interact with people. We can create differences. We can change things. Just a very simple example. If we're nice and loving and caring and supportive of people, well, we're well liked. People like to hang out with us. We're probably in a happy space. Whereas if we are a user of people, and our thought is, well, what's in it for me? You want to be friends with me? What's in it for me? This sort of thing. And if they look at everything in their world of what's in it for me, then they will not be well liked. They will be unhappy and miserable people, because they'll miss all the important things in life that makes one happy. So that way we create our own reality. What we don't create is each other's choices, because we make choices that affect other people, and they just have to deal with it. And they make choices that affect us, and we just have to deal with it. So we don't make our reality in all its detail, but we do make it in some very significant ways. And what that idea that we modify future probability means that what we see out in the world is a very accurate representation of the quality of consciousness of humanity. Yes, it's an ugly place out there because we aren't very evolved. We have a long way to go. That's why it's such an ugly place. And when we're more evolved, it will be a nicer, more beautiful place, more caring space. And we are evolving because that's evolution. But it's a slow process. But the process is working, and it's actually been speeding up. We've made more progress in the last 200 years or 300 years than we probably did in 1,000 years before that. So it's working, but it's still not such a nice place to be in many ways. And there still is a lot of low quality of consciousness, a lot of greed, self-centeredness, just general ugliness toward other people. Very, very much self-centeredness. Other people don't count. The only one that counts me. Look after number one. You got something I want? Well, if you're small and can't protect it, and nobody's going to protect it for you, then I can just go over and take it, and you just have to deal with it. That kind of an attitude, an attitude that, we see a lot. There's a lot of people that kind of have that attitude. There's a lot of institutions and corporations and other things that have an attitude like that. They'll take everything they can get without really caring too much about who it hurts. So that's us. That's the way we are. But our job is to do better than that. It's to grow up. But the system will give us help. If we want to grow up, it will help us because, as I say, as we grow up, it grows up. As we evolve, it evolves because we're just a piece of it. So it has a vested interest in our success. That's why it would reach out and push that meteor away and not let it impact here, because it's invested in our, in our growing up. And if we are growing up and we are successful, then it wouldn't want to let that just disappear because of some, random, statistical event that just happened to happen. That wouldn't be, it could interfere with that. So we will continue to have a reality to play in, but it may be a pretty harsh one. If, only 10% of the population's left, then you're not going to be able to walk down to the corner grocery store and, and buy your groceries. It's going to be back to survival kind of living. Mm-hmm. And that could, we went through that for 190,000 years of humanity walking around on Earth. It was pretty tough. And it takes a long time to grow out of that. But, there's plenty of time.
Right. And I mean, there's still people that, even though we have groceries, around the corner, that will still be in that survival mode because they're still stuck in the fear. But we are growing, we are evolving, and we have seen lots of changes. And yeah, so then that makes me think, so I know you mentioned that there are players in this world that are not really part of our world, which then we get into whether it's our individual reality that we're looking at, or we're looking at the virtual reality of the planet. But we can, who decides, like, how does some, I don't know how it works. Like, how do we get from, this huge planet with 7.5 billion people, and how do we come together? Like, do we have, I know that we've talked about past lives and different things, and we don't remember our past lives, or maybe technically we're just connecting in with a larger consciousness system anyway, and it's not really a past life, but we just have connected in with a life to understand it better, but we then feel so connected to it that we have decided it was a past life. But we keep evolving, we keep coming back into the virtual reality because it's assisting us to move to where we're wanting to go. We're making choices. We decide what, core fears that we are working through in this life. We continue on it because it is a virtual reality, and we can keep, moving back into it. So do these past lives, they're obviously a continuation and growth, and not always, we may have one life where we're kind and compassionate and loving, but then we may choose to have a different experience in the next life where we need different challenges to help us grow. It's kind of like that Pollyanna thing that some people seem to have, that, that everything is perfect, but they don't really need to grow nothing's pushing them to grow because they think everything's perfect anyway. But so we have each of these different, different evolving processes that we go through. We can make and choose which ones. We can go into different virtual realities, I assume, as well, beyond this one. We can come back, we can play. But it's always about our growth.
It's always about our growth. Yes, there are other virtual realities. You tend to come back to the ones you're used to because you already kind of understand the process and the culture and so on. All of that you say is true. It takes, what we're trying to do is let go of fear and become love. Well, that is not an easy thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do, because in order to do that, it's not intellectual. It's all at the being level. It's about not what you think, it's not what's in your mind. It's who you are. And to change who you are is not an easy thing. You have to grow up. In my book, I call it, you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and that means it takes a while to do that. It's not quick. And what happens to us is that by the time we get to be old, we tend to have trapped ourselves in a set of beliefs and ideas. And, we've been there, we've done that, we know what it is. And if we've had a really happy life, then we may be very pleasant. But if we haven't, then we're crotchety and we're, complain a lot. And, all we do talk about is our pains and this sort of thing. And at that point, you're not growing very much anymore. This open-minded part goes away. Even the skeptical part goes away. The only thing remaining is that you think you know everything already that's important, because you've been there and done that, and there isn't anything that exists really outside of your experience. It's kind of the idea. Well, then you're trapped. How are you going to keep growing? You say, if you get to that. So we tend to paint ourselves into corners with our own beliefs and ideas as we get older. So it's really a good thing to get to start over again, because in the beginning, growth is a lot quicker. We grow and we understand, we're open, it's a world, and we don't understand it, and we're trying to understand it, and we have a lot more opportunity for growth at that point. So that's why we need past lives, because changing yourself at a fundamental level is a difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of effort to do that. Pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps is a term that was in physics. It's kind of a what they call a tongue-in-cheek statement, because you can't grab hold of your boots and then pull yourself up in the air. It's a thing that you can't do, but it's a statement that means basically evolution. An athlete. Let's say you're an overweight, non-athletic person, but what you really want to do is run a marathon. Well, you have to change yourself. You can't run a marathon by being a non-athletic, overweight individual. You'll never get there. You'll fall over before you make that 26 miles or whatever it is. It'll just be impossible. But you can do it. You just have to practice and practice and practice and get in shape and trim down, build up the right muscles, build up the stamina, and then, 5 years later, 10 years later, whatever it takes, you can run a marathon and be reasonably good in it. You may not win it, but you can at least run it. So that's what I mean by pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. It's never easy. And the only way to do that is by increment, by increment, by increment. That's how you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So that's what evolution is all about. So that's what we're doing here. We're trying to evolve, and it is a very slow process. But fortunately, like any evolutionary process, is the more you evolve, the easier it is to evolve more. The more you learn, the easier it is to learn more. When you're 4 years old, not quite ready for kindergarten yet, it's really hard to learn things because you don't have the concepts, you don't have the language, you don't have the experience, you just don't have what it takes. So learning things in the outside world tends to be difficult. Now, learning the basics tends to be easier. At those ages, you're learning language, you're getting more sophisticated in your ideas. So you're learning quickly at that basic level. But the more you learn, you can learn more. So you have to learn what 5-year-olds learn so you can learn what 6-year-olds learn. And you have to learn that so you can learn what 7-year-olds learn. And it just keeps growing to where by the time you're in graduate school or have been working, in some profession for a while, you know a lot of stuff because you've been working on it a long time. And then the more quickly you can learn more. So you could be graduate school and in one thing, decide you want to change careers, and in 2 or 3 years, you could retool yourself in another whole career. Whereas it might have taken you 10 or 15 years to get there in the first place. Now you can do it more quickly. So the good news is that we are evolving more quickly now. And at the rate that we've been going, we have a chance in 20 or 30 or 50 years, in this century, we have a chance to really make huge progress. But it's only a chance. We still have free will, and it still requires us to make good choices. But we do have a chance. Everything's moving much, much faster. I mean, just the time between when I was, when I was 40 even. I'm 74 now. So even the time from 40 to now, things have changed tremendously. When I was 40, there were no cell phones. No, they didn't exist. Well, how much have cell phones changed our life, as far as communication? When I was 40, there was no, well, maybe there was. There wasn't much of an internet. It was still in its infancy. It's not like it is now. There was no Google that you could just say, well, when's the next, ball game with such and such in that stadium, and you can type it and there it is, a piece of arcane information that would be really hard to dig out if you really didn't know. You'd have to find somebody that did. Now you can get everything in a couple of seconds. None of that stuff existed. So our reality in just a few decades has changed dramatically. And think what it was like 500 years ago. From decade to decade, from century to century to century, nothing much changed. It all was similar. Yeah, there were little changes here and there, but it just was real slow. Every century was about the same as the last century. All the players changed, there were different despots in charge and, different warlords and, that were there, but it all was basically the same sort of thing. But now things are going fast. So we have an opportunity to really end up in, say, even a couple of decades to a totally different place than we are right now. So we're at a very exciting time where change is starting to get quick. And we have an opportunity to really make some big strides. We also have the opportunity to blow it all and go backwards, regress. We have that opportunity too. Yeah. It depends on the quality of our choices and our understanding and that sort of thing. But so I'm very hopeful because the first time since humanity has been here, like I say, about 200,000 years, we actually have the ability to make huge progress as a race, as opposed to just little pockets of individuals. So that's pretty powerful. We could do it, or like I said, we could blow it. But if we blow it, we get to try again. And evolution is like that. Sometimes it's one step forward and 2 steps backward, but you get to go forward again. And evolution is very sturdy. It just keeps cranking on, no matter whether it gets setbacks or not. So we will get there. We will.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation, I have to say. I have a feeling we're going to carry this over to next month and possibly even the month after that, because I still have way more questions.
Yeah. Well, it's a very big subject.
Huge.
But Laurie, in 2 decades, this idea that this is a virtual reality will be trivially obvious to even an 8-year-old. Now it's a very hard sell, and people say, that just doesn't make sense. That this reality, this physical reality is computed. Just doesn't make sense. In just 2 decades, it'll be trivially obvious because we will then have created virtual realities that are just about as real as this one. And it won't be such a big leap of imagination to see this as a virtual reality.
Cool. All right. Well, I look forward to our next conversation when we talk about this more and go into different areas of it. If there's anybody out there that have questions, please, put them in the comments. I'll look through them and we'll see what we can get to the next one. But I kind of leading towards what our own individual growth and the virtual reality we're in, how that sort of affects us. So that's where I'm sort of heading towards. I know that it always is about our choices and our fear and moving towards love. And I think that's, the most important thing. So that it's almost like that personal virtual reality that we have is probably the most important part of this larger virtual reality that's part of the larger consciousness system. But I think that's where we're the most impactful for sure. All right. Well, you have been listening to News for the Heart. We've been getting the heart of what matters with Tom Campbell. Join us again, and I look forward to it. All right. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Laurie.
Have a question for Laurie and want to be on the next News from the Heart show? Drop us a line via instant feedback at bmajor.org. News from the Heart is brought to you by Intuitive Soul and is produced by Major Radio for Clear Channel's iHeartRadio and bmajor.org.